Well, last week certainly was interesting. If you thought things were going to clear up, I'm afraid you were terribly wrong, just like the rest of us. APAC and North America both have some weirdness going on in their own respective rights, so that should make Week 17 pretty interesting. With that in mind, let's get a preview and some predictions going. Let's talk Chengdu versus the Spark on Friday morning. This one has me curious. Neither team looked fantastic last week, and I think they have some potential takeaways. Chengdu showed some good adjustments as the week went on, and the Spark maybe weren't at full potential since alexyOWL was unavailable to play in quarantine. In other words, both teams have room to grow. Chengdu are the ones to come away with a dub last week, but I also think the Spark are at the disadvantage of playing quite possibly the two best teams in the region currently. It was a tough week, but since they've otherwise been pretty consistent this year, I'd say that it's worth giving them the benefit of the doubt. A week of practice, a less prevalent opponent, and their primary playmaker being back should lead to a much more competitive performance on the surface. Admittedly though, I'm a little worried that teams have figured out that the solution to stopping the Spark lies within targeting Shy. If Guangzhou cannot adjust their gameplay accordingly, they are going to lose this game. If they fail to make those adjustments, then they lose, but if they do, I think that's their win condition, and I'm willing to bet that with alexyOWL back in the fray, that they will figure it out. It likely ends up being a tough matchup because Chengdu are not a joke, especially with this type of DPS combo, but my pick will be the Spark in a 3-2. And this pick is totally based on faith and faith alone. For all I know, the Spark will continue to perform poorly due to let's say some communication problems with them using a mixed roster. Chengdu technically have the advantage in that regard, so anything is possible. Anyway, next up is the Valiant versus the Seoul Dynasty, and to me, Seoul were one of two teams who looked very consistent in the first week of qualifiers, so they're going to be favored automatically. The Valiant showed some great fight, and they're not to be underestimated, but I'd say that it's hard to take them super seriously after losing to the Charge. Well that, and maybe they aren't as comfortable in the new meta. I think that Dia has been pretty solid on Junker Queen, and the DPS have been doing alright, but I'm worried that the supports are getting overwhelmed. The synergy just isn't as strong as it could be since Molly is on the bench. You have Sashin and NYXL trying to mesh together, and right now it doesn't seem like that's going too well, especially when you consider the fact that Sashin is off-rolling. Going from tank to Brig, I mean, it feels like a bit of an adjustment, but maybe that's just me. There's a lot of coordination involved with this kind of composition, and Seoul have it down a lot better, so my pick will be a 3-0 for them. I saw a lot more aggression and split-second decision-making during that first week compared to the Valiant. Prophet, Stalker, and Smurf were all excellent leaders, and that's something the Valiant just don't have to me, so I'm not expecting a great match. Moving into North America for the first day, you've got the Atlanta Reign taking on the London Spitfire. Given their rivalry, close placement in the standings, and this potentially being the rookie debut of Speedily, let's call this a key match of the week. And this one's a toughie. The Reign are always somebody who can turn up at any given moment, but so far this year, London have definitely had their number. To be completely honest, the Reign have been the team with more visible struggles in this meta so far. Their adjustment period has taken longer. The first week was not very good, and even last week, even though they beat Paris 3-0, they weren't amazing. Maybe the individuality factor is playing a role in them not doing as well, and if there's one thing we've learned so far from this new meta, it's that talent and playmaking potential are just less prevalent. Solo carrying does not win you games nearly as often. The teamwork and callouts simply have to be perfect, and the team that has been better with telegraphing those types of things are the Spitfire. They showed it against Houston, and they showed it against Boston as well. So I say that London win this series in a 3-2 scoreline. London have that mental edge. We saw it especially during that previous meeting, you know? London have all the confidence in the world against Atlanta, and when people like Hottie are feeling themselves, that's when you know you're in big trouble. Atlanta are not a team to stay down for long though, so I'm not really thinking this is going to be a blowout. Now we're entering more of a simple territory. The NYXL versus the San Francisco Shock. While the NYXL have been up and down, the Shock have practically only been up, and the fact that they have a chance to break the win streak record is only going to make them extra motivated. And we're already seeing improvement out of this group as well with every passing game. Proper, Violet, Kilo, they've all looked especially good as of late, and they've shown no signs of slowing down. And all New York really have to counter this overwhelming power as Yaki, and obviously that is not enough. San Francisco should be looking at a nice sweep. It's a complete and utter team diff in every way, and if we're being honest, nobody trusts the NYXL right now. They're up and down every single week. You really never know what you're going to get with them, so the Shock have this no problemo. Coming up next will be the next key match of the week: the Vancouver Titans versus the Washington Justice. This game intrigues for two reasons. First of all, both teams are playing better than expected, but second, whoever wins this game moves up to 3-1 and likely has an excellent chance of qualifying for the tournament. Let's break it down. The Titans have gained a wealth of new confidence in this meta and quite honestly have looked dominant at times. Aspire has played out of his mind and the hot streak has no end in sight, but their opponent has proven to be no joke themselves. In spite of losing 3 starters, the Justice still look pretty okay. Their coaches must have figured something out because this did not look like a team who was supposed to be completely lifeless. The new starter stepped up their game and Decay has been doing the rest. The fact that they beat Florida as bad as they did is really impressive. They've got this meta down to a science and are still quite difficult to take down. I'll be honest, I am fully expecting a good game. Both rosters are in a decent place confidence-wise, and they're hungry to prove themselves, and technically they're both not quite out of the race just yet to maybe be in the playoffs. The Titans are obviously a long shot, but it's still possible in theory, especially if they do good in this tournament cycle. But in my honest opinion, the Titans are the team to pick. My pred is going to be a 5-map thriller in their favor. I wouldn't necessarily say they have more firepower. If anything, that probably belongs to Washington. It's more that right now they are truly the more stable environment. I know the Justice proved everybody wrong last week. They looked pretty good against the Mayhem, but is that sustainable? That is my main question. I really don't know. Next week, or I guess I should say this week, really could end up being a disaster for them. They might look a lot more confused, less confident, and the Titans are on the rise right now, so I'm gonna pick them. The Justice certainly are the better team on paper though, let me make that perfectly clear. They have been more decisive, their play has maybe been a bit cleaner, and they also play pretty fearlessly in this kind of meta, which is good for them. But again, just this factor of not knowing what I'm going to get with them in their current state kind of turns me off a little bit. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, let's talk about Seoul versus Guangzhou. Yeah. There's not much to see here, ladies and gentlemen. The Charge had a decent showing against the Valiant, but they obviously have a long way to go still. Meanwhile, Seoul shook off their poor tournament like it was nothing more than a bad dream. I'm immediately just going to put out a 3-0 in favor of Seoul, as there's not much to talk about. What we can talk about, though, is how good Seoul looked last week. And I gotta say, their plan to run Profit on Brig was pretty intelligent. It maximizes their potential without really sacrificing any comfort. Stalker is an exceptional Genji player in his own right, and Prophet has a lot of experience on Brig since he did play her during GOATS and even before then. His general understanding of the hero is likely better than what Creative offered. Of course, he got traded, but you get the idea. I'm a fan of this lineup they're utilizing, and there's a good chance they end up going far, and there's no way that the Charge are going to stop that rampage. Now for the Spark and Valiant game, and this one might be decent just because both teams are in a pretty similar situation. They run these mixed lineups in a meta where being on the same page is absolutely critical. Solo carrying is less of an option, so what it really comes down to is how much stock you're putting into Hangzhou's poor first week. If you think it's very telling of how they'll do this stage, you might favor the Valiant, especially when they were fairly close to going 2-0 last week instead of 0-2. The Dia Junker Queen as well as Easy Han Sojourn are no joke. But the problem the Valiant seem to be facing is this ongoing theme of not being clutch. They played better than the Spark last week, definitely, but they also played worse opponents. The Spark should at least play a little better now that they're playing the Valiant, and it's because of this that I think the Spark will be winning the series in a 3-1. If it's anything more than a blowout, I'm expecting the Valiant to lose. They have to dominate this game. It's been an ongoing theme all year, and I fully expect it to keep going until they show me otherwise. Their record in Map 5s in close games is abysmal. Taking us to the end of APAC for the second day is the Dragons versus the Fusion. The idea of Philly pushing Shanghai makes this intriguing. I think it's always a matchup to look out for, but after what we saw last week, maybe we're not as convinced Philly are ready this time. Something just felt off with their play. Maybe it was Carpe playing a lot over MN3, maybe it was the hesitance to not play a ton of Ashe, or perhaps it was their poor Junker Queen play. Their overall game plan, and gameplay for that matter, is in a bit of a weird spot. And the Dragons, I'd say that they're thriving early on. It's a really good meta for a lot of their players, and Whoaryu's Genji is still putting in the work. Then you have Lip doing his usual thing, Lee J going back on Lucio, and Void, who honestly is looking pretty nice on the Junker Queen. The Dragons have the better vision, and their years of synergy are paying off big time. I find their level of trust in one another to be a huge advantage compared to what Philly are doing, so I think they're going to net a 3-0 victory. Philly just don't have that level of experience yet. In addition to this, my theory is them not being as good on Junker Queen is going to continue to hold up. And that'll be a major problem if it comes true, since Void seems like he is a lot more in his element. But enough on that matter. Let's talk about Boston versus Toronto. And alright, Defiant fans, you win. This team has largely been better than I anticipated, and I admit I have been wrong about them. They're in prime position to make their own homestand and have beaten multiple noteworthy opponents while showing the most consistency they have all year. Hisun, though, they've come alive. But more importantly, Twilight showed way better decision making and positioning on the break compared to the first week. The team as a whole is realizing their potential and they're showing improvement. They're in a pretty smooth groove, and what better time to continue this kind of groove than against Boston? Without going too heavy on the details, I can confidently say Toronto win this series in 4. The Uprising have been pretty meh outside of one match so far, and the sudden addition of Mag may have set them back as the rest of the team now has to adjust to his style, and vice versa. The Defiant have done so much more to impress, and they don't really face any extreme adjustments. They have the same team, and they're looking pretty good. Now for the middle matchup on Saturday. You have the Paris Eternal taking on the LA Gladiators, and I'd say this is a blowout for more reasons than one. Yeah, the Glads are obviously the better roster, but now they're going to be very frustrated. Losing 4 straight matches is going to mean that they have little to no chance of making the Toronto homestand. At this point, it would take a miracle and near flawless play. There have been some clearly visible struggles in their gameplay, and you can see it on the players' faces too. But just because they are down in the dumps does not mean that this game is not important to them. They just have to keep on pushing. Their high placement in the standings is on the line here. There's no way that they want to waste a gimme game like this one. Paris don't stand much of a chance, they're still way too new. This should be a 3-0 for the Glads. Regardless of their shortcomings, the Glads have still been pretty competitive throughout this entire tournament cycle, and you'd expect them to eventually clean things up, especially as Happy gets more comfortable in the team environment. The Eternal just don't have what it takes against the Glads, simple as that. So now it's time to round out Saturday, where we have the Houston Outlaws taking on the Vancouver Titans. And after the severe collapse that Houston showed us last week, anything's possible here, especially when the Titans are playing pretty well, you know? They're a massive threat. That confidence is going to keep on growing and growing, especially as Deepay has said that he finds this meta fun to coach. Everybody's enjoying themselves for once, and that's when a team becomes the most dangerous regardless of their record. The Titans are on a mini resurgence, and if they can kick the Outlaws while they're down, it very well might continue. I'd like to see Aspire shut down Merit like how Sparker did last week. If they play with aggression and with confidence, I don't see why they can't win this. But in my honest opinion, the Outlaws are favored. They're the team who is usually pretty good at bouncing back. And when it comes to like general decision making and team play, I still very much prefer them. Unlike New York, the ceiling of the Outlaws is quite high, and usually they do pretty well in games where they're obviously favored, so I'm picking the Outlaws in a 4-map series. It's very possible that we witness a pretty good gameplay out though, because both of these green teams are pretty decent. But the simple fact is, the Outlaw support line is in somewhat better shape than that of New York's, so I don't think the Titans are going to get off so easily this time. That simple organization factor is going to make them a challenge, and just based on who Vancouver have beaten so far, I don't know if I trust them to pull off an upset of this caliber just yet. It's a bit different compared to like a Washington upset, let's say, because for starters, we have seen the Titans push them to the distance when the Justice were at full strength, but also the Justice are just in a lot more of a weird situation, so an upset there seems a lot more likely to me. That's all for Saturday, so moving into your Sunday APAC games, first, you've got the Guangzhou Charge taking on the Philadelphia Fusion. And I won't lie, as much as I want this to be a good game, I kind of feel like the Charge got lucky to run into the Valiant so early on. That is the reason they mainly showed as much life as they did. They took advantage of the fact that their synergy was no better. But against the Fusion, that just will not slide. It's hard to put a ton of faith in this Charge team after just one victory. They still have new pieces to incorporate fully, and the star power and comfort might make them, take a map, let's say, but the Fusion do have a tendency to bounce back from tough matches, so I think they're going to do well here. After some learning from what could end up being a blowout loss in the Shanghai series, I expect them to put those lessons into full use. What doesn't kill this group tends to make them stronger. Philly win 3-1. The simple fact that the Charge are too much of a wild card still makes me unwilling to commit fully. I like that they beat the Valiant, and I'm happy with how their new guys look, but Philly want this more, so they should have this under wraps. Now, to end APAC for the week is the Dragons and Hunters game. The Hunters are always a threat to look out for sure, especially when they start to figure things out as we saw at the end of last week. And technically, Shanghai did not have much of a challenge in their first week, so we don't know how much more resistance they'll face when they play Chengdu. And it's not like we can sit here and say that Shanghai are going to beat them down in the same way that Seoul did, because Chengdu are going to be rocking a much different game plan compared to that first match. What it more so comes down to, at least to me, is the Junker Queen play. Shanghai kind of get that same advantage as they do in the Philly series, as Void is such a big-time player on this kind of mechanically demanding hero. He's going to be tough to keep up with. But also, Chengdu to me just seemed kind of meh on the Queen. The individual decision-making as well as playing around her seemed a little off. It's this main factor that leads me to believe the Dragons win 3-1. It's not the only thing though, don't get me wrong. Shanghai's DPS definitely counter out Chengdu's, which pretty much leaves them with no advantages. The Dragons should have their number in the series, as it's simply a better meta for them. On the topic of interesting matchups, how about London versus Washington? Was it just dumb luck that Washington won last week? And what about London? Was their dominance a sign of things to come? With how this tournament has gone so far, it's impossible to tell. But if we're basing this on the probability of success, you most likely favor the Spitfire, as their environment, kind of like with Vancouver, is just more stable. And I genuinely do think the Justice, to a certain extent, did luck out against Florida, as clearly the Mayhem were not ready for primetime then, and they've struggled a lot in general as of late. I'd like to see the Justice make an upset happen again before I start to fully commit to their underdog story. But also, I really like the flair that London have shown me the last couple of games, and they have a tendency to beat opponents they've already beaten once, so how about we stick with that trend and a 3-1 for them? I'm a big fan of their current energy and just that general press W mentality. That level of confidence is going to take them far, especially against a team with a lot of question marks surrounding them. That just about wraps up my thought on London versus Washington, so next we have the Atlanta Reign and the Houston Outlaws, and oh, decisions here. Two wacky teams going head-to-head, and I really don't know what to think, I'll be honest. The Outlaws should be slightly favored in theory, but I'm starting to sense that this team might be on the downward trend. With another player from their original roster, aka Iris, being traded, you have to wonder what their current mindset is like over there. I know he hasn't been playing as of late, and there were rumors he was getting traded, but still, that's gonna be upsetting. And that especially goes for their best player, Pelican, as he's likely taking the loss of Piggy and now Iris pretty hard. And since they're also coming off a rough loss to London from last week, I'd say that they could be in for a struggle against Atlanta, or maybe even Vancouver. I wouldn't be surprised if they end up going 0-2 this week. It's very possible. Now, with that said, Atlanta aren't in an amazing place themselves, so it could be a pretty close game. There's a good chance that I'm very wrong, but my gut feeling is a 3-2 for the Atlanta Reign. This should not be a game they win on paper, but Houston's mindset is a little unstable, and to be honest, I'm expecting a massive game out of Kai, as he just seems like he's overdue for a huge performance. But I'm also thinking that Atlanta are looking for some serious revenge. That C9 is likely still on their minds, and they're ready to get over it once and for all. The Reign respond well to these types of situations. Extra motivation does this group good, and I believe that's going to play out firsthand in this Houston series. But then again, this is just a gut feeling at the end of the day, so there's a good chance this pred ends up terribly wrong. But anyway, let's move on to the last game of the week, the Florida Mayhem versus the Dallas Fuel. And here there is not a lot of doubts in who the victor will be. The Dallas Fuel have been nothing but solid since the beginning of this tournament cycle. Not perfect, but obviously very good. Their synergy is shining through in this meta, and I'd say they're slowly but surely doing a better job of playing around Sparkle's Genji. I very much like what the Fuel have shown me so far. And then you have the Mayhem on the other side of things. Their results have not been very special, and after getting rolled against Washington, I doubt that anybody's going to be trusting them. The Fuel should be winning this in a sweep. Florida in theory have the right pieces to make this kind of meta work, but as a mixed roster in a heavily communication-based meta, their comms and their teamwork especially need a lot of improvement. And also, I'm not really a fan of what they're doing at support right now. I'm sure there's a reason for it, but the fact that Animo is on Brig instead of Lucio is completely messing with my mind, and it gives me some very weird vibes. Florida have their work cut out for them, and that's not good heading into a matchup with the Fuel. And on that note, that's going to do it for this week's Preds. Should be a pretty fun time, am I right? There's a lot of stuff to discover with multiple teams either looking to secure a position in this tournament or just prove themselves in general. Are you guys looking forward to the games? Let me know why down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to my channel if you're new. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.